which prompts another follow-up question, and this is going to be the last one I'll ask before turning it over to the audience, which is really from the left. It does strike, I mean, if you are coming from a much more, say, socialistic perspective, you might say it's way too gradual a policy for the kind of crisis that we are in today. So how do you address that?
Right, it is a very fair criticism. The way, you know, I mean, we saw this in the election last week, that we have really deep economic equity issues that we need to deal with. And that's one of the reasons why we've tried to keep that a little bit separate and say, you know, we need revenues to pay for, you know, our public transit infrastructure and our renewable energy. But, you know, trying to raise those revenues through the carbon fee causes a lot of problems, you know, both politically and mechanistically. So if we separate those issues and we say, yes, we need to find ways to raise revenues and we need to work on that, right? And we have proposals in the legislature to do that. But on the carbon pricing policy, the focus really should be purely on emissions reductions, right? So creating the right incentive to reduce emissions, and therefore the tax, if you will, should not be regressive, right? It should make people whole who can't afford it, and you know, of course, it can place a small burden on people who are already very, very wealthy because they won't notice, right? Mm-hmm. In order for that to be true, you have to start small, right? Because if you start at a high enough tax, then the upfront burden is really high on people. And also you have to return most of the revenues, right? I mean, you could argue about, you know, should it be 80%, 90%, or 100% that is returned to people? But it really can't get much lower than 80%, because at that point you run into, again, equity issues where you're increasing the tax burden on people who make the least amount of money, and you want to avoid that, both, you know, out of fairness, but also politically, it becomes a non-starter if that's your starting proposal. Now, in terms of the amount of the tax, you know, again, nobody knows what the right price is, right? I mean, you need the market to set the price. And so the idea is to start small and then over time increase the price. And we've seen that work very successfully in British Columbia, for example, right? They're now up to $30 a ton equivalent. The challenge for you know, a principality like Massachusetts is that you don't want to get too far ahead of everybody else around you, because then you get into issues of, well, now you're making it more expensive to operate a business or to live in Massachusetts, and so then people are just going to flee and go live in more, or you know, start businesses in more polluting jurisdictions. So that's the other consideration, is you start small, you grow it, and then as other jurisdictions around you start having carbon pricing, then altogether you start raising the carbon price. And so really for us, the goal ultimately is to have a national price on carbon, and really ideally there would be a global price on carbon, not necessarily just one price, but each country would have a price on carbon, and you could make trade adjustments, you know, in import-export activities, so that everybody is paying for their pollution, right? So that nobody has an advantage and says, well, I can produce these goods cheaper by, you know, polluting the atmosphere, which then hurts everybody. So it is really important to keep that global perspective in mind, and not to say, well, you know, we should have $100 a ton in Massachusetts, because it'll just never happen, you know.
Right. All right, well, that's a great way to start this conversation. And I think the audience has already posted a couple of interesting and challenging questions. So Quinton, you ready to take your wisdom to the masses here?
Sure.
Okay.
Hit me up.
All right. So here's a question from Peter Kirby. I'm just going to read it out. Thanks, Peter. I understand the regional energy grid exchange already includes carbon pricing in some form. What is that, and how will it intersect with the proposed carbon pricing bill?
Right. Thanks, Peter. Great question. So we do have what is called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, that operates in the Northeast. And it is a form of carbon pricing called cap and trade. So the idea behind cap and trade is that you put a cap on the amount of pollution that you're going to allow, and then you allow the price to float, right? The kind of carbon price we've been talking about so far is the opposite, which is you set the price, and then whatever happens to the emissions. Hopefully, it reduces them. So in the case of RGGI and cap and trade in general, we found that it works best when you're dealing with a small set of large emitters, right? So in our case, power plants. And so what it does is it allows the power plants between each other to trade on their emissions, right? So if one power plant is really efficient, then it can essentially sell permits to power plants that are less efficient, so that together they all stay below the cap, right? And that price, of course, gets passed on to the consumers through their electric bills. And it's very small, right? We were talking about $10 a ton. Well, the RGGI price right now is maybe around $15 a ton. So it's not a huge amount of money, but we do have to account for it. And so in the legislation that was proposed in the previous session, the electricity sector was exempt from the carbon price in order to not create a conflict with the cap and trade system that's already in place. Over time, you would either replace the cap and trade if the fee dividend mechanism was working really well, or you could simply subtract the RGGI price from the total that people are paying on their electricity bill, say, for example, right? So if the carbon fee is at $40 a ton and the RGGI fee is at $20 a ton, then on your electricity consumption, you would pay an additional $20 in the carbon fee because you've already paid $20 through cap and trade. So those are some of the different ways that they can interact.
Great. So one more question here, and please do, if you have any questions, type them out in the chat window. I'll be reading them out. So Kurt has a question. He says, seems to me that carbon offset purchases are a complementary near-term tactic. Love to hear perspective on relatively well-off individuals and organizations stepping up to buy their own carbon offsets. Is it a valid put your money where your mouth is form of climate action? What offset programs seem most successful?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are definitely some very successful programs. There's a program called Mass Energy, which is the Massachusetts Consumer Energy Alliance. And they allow individuals and organizations to donate a little bit of extra money based on their electricity consumption, let's say. And then they pull that money and they use it to buy renewable energy credits or certificates, which are a way to help finance renewable energy projects, right? So it's a little bit indirect, but the net result is that you're essentially donating towards construction of renewable energy projects in New England. So that's a great program for people to participate in as individuals or as organizations. There's also larger scale efforts that are underway, including MIT just announced, I think a couple of weeks ago, then they will be offsetting 17% of MIT's energy consumption through buying into a solar farm in North Carolina. So that's an example of institutions starting to voluntarily offset their pollution in these ways. It really works well for especially institutions like universities and cities that plan to be around for a long time, because it is an upfront investment that can result in measurable reductions in their long-term energy costs.
So a couple more questions here. So this one is from Portia, but before that, I'm going to ask you a question, because you just mentioned that, institutions that intend to be around for a while, towns and cities, universities, there's an incentive for them to invest in clean energy. So is there a policy regime that is catering to those kinds of long-term investments? So which is maybe either on top of the carbon pricing or a form of it that's different?
Right. So we do have at the federal level, of course, a tax incentive that's 30% back on the cost of a renewable installation. But that incentive is declining over the next few years. The cost of renewables is coming down really fast. So that by itself is an incentive already. And then if you add a carbon price, that creates a further incentive, right? Because now you're increasing the cost of not going with renewables. So we're seeing, for example, in the city of Cambridge, where we have created the Net Zero Action Plan, we're seeing the city itself leading that charge with the schools, right? So we are rebuilding our schools and investing heavily in renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies in those school constructions, so that the city will start to see those savings over time from those initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Great.
But creating a framework is a challenge.
Mm-hmm. So here's the next question. It's from Portia. She says, can you profile some other countries that have programs similar to what you're describing, and how their methods may or may not be optimal for the United States?
Yeah, so the gold star example that we use in Massachusetts is British Columbia and Canada, which passed a carbon tax a few years ago. They actually call it a carbon tax. And it's been very successful. It was very similar in the sense that it started off small and then increased over time and stopped at $30 a ton, which is where it is now. Some of the interesting things that happened there was that it was actually passed by a relatively conservative state government, and then was challenged from the left, and that challenge didn't succeed. So it was actually very popular with the populace and the businesses. One of the things that they did do differently there was that they, instead of doing a direct rebate to businesses, they actually reduced the corporate taxes that businesses would pay. And again, as we covered that earlier, because we have a large nonprofit sector in Massachusetts, we think we need to do that a little differently. There's, China has announced that they're doing cap and trade on a province by province basis. And of course, California is going with cap and trade that is going to be more economy-wide. So it will be, similar to RGGI, but it applies to everything, not just to power plants. So that's an interesting experiment to watch. Again, as I said earlier, we tend to think that cap and trade works best when you're dealing with a small number of large emitters, but in California, they're saying, let's do this economy-wide and see what happens. So I think overall, it's good, that we have these different experiments going on, and we can learn from them and understand what works best, and then hopefully use that learning to craft a national policy, which is what we've seen in Canada, where British Columbia had the most advanced carbon pricing, but some of the other provinces had it as well. And now the Prime Minister recently announced that Canada will institute a national carbon tax. So that's the hope, that we can accomplish a similar peak here in the US.
All right. Thanks, Quinton. So we have a viewer, Robert, who we're going to welcome to the panel. So Robert, thank you very much for joining us.
Just a comment first, Rajesh. I'm just amazed MIT isn't paying you enough, so you have to moonlight for Uber to make up your pay. Anyway, here's the comments. I don't know anything about the what's being discussed, so I'm not making really any negative comments. But the problem, well, in fact, I looked on the ClimateX change, and I saw there was someone there called Roger Freeman endorsing carbon pricing, 20 billion spent in Massachusetts, fossil fuel. So that revenue could be done to create jobs. But you've already mentioned, or hinted at, for me, the problem is, where's the level playing field? Supposing you have a business and they say, goodness, this is a tremendous opportunity. We just close our factory, outsource all the jobs to China. We will then get our, rebate, and China's giving out all the pollution, so to speak. So I haven't quite understood how you get around that. And there is this tax is bad, competitive industry jobs. There'll be the Donald Trump argument and so on. So that's just that point. But the other thing for me is also, as I say, this isn't an argument against it, but it is still very focused on the economics, and maybe to some extent we have to be. But there's a book by a man called George Lakoff, Don't Think of an Elephant. So this, in fact, keeps us thinking of the elephant. It's, is there a saving for me? Will I get some money? Instead of thinking, goodness, I just want to keep this beautiful world that I'm in, and put some more moral arguments. So it's how does one balance these two things? Anyway, just one other thing. Rajesh asked me to sing some Rabindra Songit last week. So I've actually recorded it. And if you look in your, the global, is it called Global Action? Last week, I've put a little thing with some little discussion of Rabindranath, because Rabindranath was a really early pioneer in environmentalism. And he would have been very much for action on climate change. But the song I've chosen is a very beautiful one. It starts, Tumi kamon kore gan korohe guni, ami oba koe shuni, tumi kamon kore gan korohe guni. And it's really, in a way, deep down, it's about the universe. Yes, it's this universe seen in this big span, and we're just listening to this kind of huge song. So it's more than just about economics. So that's why I've just put that in there. But Rajesh, have a listen. You've encouraged me to do it, and I want feedback. I mean, you've opened me up. Actually, I must say, I've always very much been the backroom person. I don't like publicity, but you encouraged me to do it. I'll let myself in for it. So there it is. So anyway, back to you. Back to.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah. So on the first point around employees, so that's another reason why in Massachusetts in particular, we focused on returning a rebate based on the number of employees or full-time equivalents at the organization, be it a factory or a nonprofit like a hospital or a university. So that creates at least a subtle incentive for employing people, but it certainly precludes the scenario that you described, where an entity could, shift its operations outside of the state of Massachusetts and still benefit from a carbon price. Now that said, for particular industries, it may be necessary to make some adjustments to make sure that they don't become instantly uncompetitive when you impose a carbon tax or a carbon fee. And they did have to do some of that in British Columbia. But again, the idea is to make a few adjustments where necessary, and then over time, as people's practices begin to shift, then you can get rid of those as well. To speak to the moral argument and the question of, it's not just about economics, of course, that's what drives me, that's what drives, a lot of people who come to climate activism. And it's a very important part of what motivates us as individuals to keep taking action. But the challenge that we face is that not everybody feels that way. And the problem is so big and so dangerous that we can't afford to wait until we can convince everybody else that they should really care about nature or about the earth the way that we do. And so we do have to offer solutions that can also appeal to people who may not feel the way we do, but still causes them to participate in the right way so that we can in fact accomplish our goal of saving the earth. I carry on some long-term conversations with people who are very conservatively minded, and in one particular example, I was going back and forth with somebody about climate change, and at some point in the conversation, he mentioned that he was driving a hybrid and he had solar panels on his roof. And I said, wait, why are you doing that if you don't even believe in climate change? And he said, well, I don't believe in, sending money to terrorists, So people are motivated by different things. And at some level, it doesn't matter to us, right? As long as they're doing the right thing, they are supporting the cause that we deeply believe in and ultimately help us accomplish our goal.
This is a really, really hot topic because, can businesses stay competitive? Will the economy tank? So, and there are at least one more question with that in the frame. So Dan Katzenberger from Minneapolis, he asks, how does one respond to critics of a carbon tax that argue that a US-based carbon tax will result in higher business costs, thus making the US less competitive with other countries with lower energy costs? Is there a way to view a carbon tax as a benefit to US businesses or to the US?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, it goes back to, this macroeconomic issue of ultimately, in the ideal view of the world where there's carbon taxing, each country would have a carbon tax that, makes sense to them. And then you would be able to do what are called border adjustments, right? So that if we are importing things from China and their carbon tax is lower than ours, then we can basically attach the difference between our two carbon fees as a kind of import duty, right? And so this creates a level playing field globally, and it does create then a potential benefit, which is that if we can reduce our pollution, let's say in the US, relative to another or another country, then it is actually cheaper for us to produce the equivalent product, right? Because the energy cost for us is also less. And so we would become more competitive. But it does require that everybody is playing this game. Now, the good news is that we do have now an international agreement, the Paris Agreement, and we have seen China step up on carbon pricing. Now, the bad news is we just elected Donald Trump, so the US may choose not to participate in that agreement for the next 4 years. But even so, I think the opportunity remains for, in the longer term, to create that kind of environment where we are economically rewarding reducing pollution globally, thereby creating incentives for everyone to be innovative and to come up with more efficient solar panels and other technologies and approaches to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately climate change.
I mean, I just want to add one thing, which is that the people who, especially the businesses, the large businesses who complain about carbon pricing, are more than happy to offshore their operations to save on labor costs, right? So it's a little specious to say that, you know, only carbon is going to make you less competitive. I think that that's a straw man argument to a large extent.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the challenges is that in fact the energy cost overall is very low, right? In terms of your overall cost of doing business, and so that in itself creates a disincentive for people to even worry about where their energy is coming from.
All right. So I don't know if this might be our last question, but if not, it's our second to last question. It's 12:54. Ray is asking, I've heard that California's carbon tax program isn't working well at this time. Is that true? And if so, what needs to be done to correct the program deficiencies?
Right. So I unfortunately don't know a whole lot about what's happening in California. I know that they've just very recently moved to a cap and trade approach, and again, I've said before that we tend to think that doesn't work so well when you're trying to address a large number of individual consumers as opposed to a small number of large emitters. But it's a valid experiment, and it's good that California is trying. And if they find out some ways to make that work effectively, then maybe it is a good solution. If they don't, hopefully Massachusetts in the meantime will do a fee and dividend system and show the benefits and any drawbacks of that approach, right? So really using the states as the laboratory as our founders envisioned it would be, so that we can come up with the best solution in the end.
Great. Now, one final question that's from Kurt. He says that there's a website, Carbon Tax Center, carbontax.org, and he's asking if it's trustworthy, reasonable, whatever you might want to say about it.
Yeah, we do trust and use that website. It is more general information about carbon pricing. Of course, our websites in Massachusetts at CABI and Climate Exchange are really focused on the Massachusetts effort to implement carbon pricing.
Thank you very much, Quinton, for sharing your thoughts. And we hope to see much more action in Massachusetts in the next few years. And it would be great to be working together on this. So thank you once again. And we will be back next week for our last ClimateX webinar on Monday for the fall. So, and that will be Chris Neidel, another co-founder of the MIT Alumni for Climate Action Leadership. So thank you, Quinton, and I'll invite Mark again to say a couple of words.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I just really appreciate Quinton taking the time. I thought it was super informative, and really appreciate all the people who tuned in. It was a great turnout and great questions. And I just remind everybody that if you have any follow-up questions that you forgot to ask while you were here, you can add them to the ClimateX website, and we'll enlist Quinton to respond accordingly. So thanks again, Quinton, very much.
All right. Bye, everybody.